Hi, I'm Charlene Tate and I'm the Deputy Chief Executive of Scottish Autism, and I'm here along with Nick from the National Autistic Society. Today we want to talk to you about the concept of a commissioner to support the needs of autistic people.
Thanks so much, Charlene. As Charlene says, I'm Nick Ward. I'm the Director of the National Autistic Society. And the way we're going to structure this is I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we got to the idea that a commissioner might be something that would make a big difference. And then Charlene are going to talk a little bit more about what a commissioner would do and some of the things that they would have in their power. So the first thing that we sort of started with was that we heard time and time again through both of our organisations, the people that we work with, the people that are members of our respective organisations, that autistic peoples and families that we support were just coming up against the same issues. And these were issues that no matter what the government intervention might be, no matter what new policy might be announced, they were the same things. And the lived reality on the ground for people wasn't shifting. So we were being told over and over again that people, both autistic people and their families, were being ignored by the system, that their needs weren't being fully listened to, and that when they were trying to access the appropriate services and support, they weren't able to do so. You know, we heard constantly the language of fighting, that in order to get what I need for myself, in order to get what I need for my child, in order to try and sometimes save the state money or support, I have to fight the system in order to get that. And fundamentally, we think we all know that that is unfair and isn't right. We also heard time and times again about people being treated inappropriately by that system. So sometimes autistic people being castigized and not given the time to explain how they're feeling or how the situation is affecting them. We also heard as well that many people were sadly having their human rights abused. We know this was taking place where people were being put, for example, in inappropriate settings, such as hospitals, rather than given the support that they needed. And we also knew that for the vast majority of people, the support that they need is in their community. And that support is for people to have before they get to crisis. But for some reason, our system wasn't allowing that to take place. So we identified, I suppose, what we would call an accountability gap. We realized that the issue wasn't so much that autistic people didn't have the rights that they needed. It was more that those rights were being systematically ignored and that there was no way for people to address that gap. So if, for example, I was unable to get the support I needed and I had to fight against my local authority or someone else to get that, once I was told no, there were very few places that I could go. That those poor service experiences were sadly very, very common, indeed chronic throughout the system, but there was no means of redress for ordinary people unless they had access to massive resources. And we already know through so much of the sector that actually a lot of these burdens fall hardest on those with the least resource. So we wanted to think a little bit about why is nothing being done before on this? Why has no one said before, actually, the rights of autistic people exist, but they're systematically being ignored, and there's nothing that anyone seems to be able to do about it? And there's a couple of reasons. The first was that it takes a long time to realize that rights are being ignored systematically. You have to gather quite a lot of evidence to realize that what's happening to someone in Aberdeen is the same as what's happening to someone in Wick or in Edinburgh or in Glasgow. And it takes a lot of communication to be able to map individually where these things are happening to start to see patterns emerging. I think the second reason is another systemic one, which is that the Scottish Human Rights Commission, which is a brilliant organisation, and when it was established was one of the first in the world, is unique in that, and so unfortunately, it's not allowed to do casework. So it cannot look at one individual case of human rights being abused and deal with that. It can only look at large systemic problems. And what that means, understandably, is that much of their attention has been at other human rights issues. Now, I don't think that's right, and others won't either, but understandably that if you've got someone that can only deal with the system, they look for the biggest populations they can affect. And unfortunately, the autistic population is a relatively small one. And we haven't always had that united voice in what we were asking for. And I think the final one of why this has been done before is that the legal system in Scotland is quite different, as you know, to the one in England, where it isn't particularly supportive of individuals or charities doing private prosecutions or taking, so for example, taking a organisation or authority to court to have those rights upheld. And indeed, we've seen some quite negative examples of that in our legal system so far. So looking at all these problems, we said, what is the thing that we think will make the most difference? Because we knew we were coming up to the Scottish Parliament and elections. So we did a process where we went and engaged with different organisations and with different autistic people to try and understand both what the particular issues were that affected individuals and that affected families, and what the systemic issues were, to try to figure out what one thing we thought would make the most difference in changing the lived experience of people on the ground, because that's what we really wanted to get to. We wanted to make sure that what we are proposing was something that would actually change someone's experience in trying to get the support or trying to access the system that they needed. Because I think we've all been here before, where we've had plenty of reviews, we've had plenty of meetings and all sorts of stuff to try and figure things out, and strategies, but actually the lived experience of autistic people and their families on the ground hasn't shifted as much as we want. So in that situation, you have to stop, you have to take a breath, and you have to say, we want to think about something different. And that different thing that we came up with, alongside our partners and our members and the people that we listened to, was a commissioner. And this is a commissioner who we believe will make a real difference to the lives of autistic people and their families. So I'm going to hand over to Charlene now to tell you a little bit more about that.
Thanks, Nick. That's a great summary of what brought us to where we are now. I want to say a little bit about the concept of a commissioner, as well as what we might see and envisage that a commissioner would do. And I think it's important to say that at the moment we've got these high level bits of thinking, and we don't have the detail. That's a very long process to get to the detail. So it's important that we are not going into this with any fixed ideas, and we're also not going into it without appreciating that we're in a very challenging economic context, and that we're in a very challenging social context at the moment with the pandemic. But there's a lot to be said for taking the opportunity to reflect and think differently in this context, and that's what I think we've done. And I think we've seen that there's quite a lot of opportunity to actually get into people's lives, if you like, at an earlier stage and get things right, rather than waiting for things to unravel. And then we're in a situation where what we're doing is perpetually funding crisis. So there's a bit of realism there about the backdrop against which we're operating. So I want to kind of reassure people that we know that this is not, a straightforward ask. So there's lots to consider about how it would operate, and in our early stages of thinking, we were, of course, very focused on an autism commissioner for autistic people, a defender of autistic people's rights. And through COVID, we've had the opportunity to work with other stakeholders through the Scottish Government Transition and Transformation Group, looking at what's happening around COVID. That gave us the opportunity to engage with other stakeholders, particularly colleagues who work with people with a learning disability. And I think it's vital that we stress that we know there are significant differences between autistic people and people with a learning disability. What we've seen through COVID is there are common challenges in terms of access to health support, access to services, access to information and advice, and also some of the challenges that services have in supporting people in the right way and in a safe way. So what we've considered is the commonalities between those two populations, whilst recognising there are still some significant differences. I think that's important because we know that autistic people have often struggled with their autistic identity being conflated with other conditions or diagnoses, however you term it. We know there's still a lot of misunderstanding around autism and autistic people, and for that reason we welcome the Scottish Government's focus on raising public awareness, and it's incumbent on us all who work in services and in policy areas to retain those unique needs of people and to understand them whilst looking at sort of common issues that we can solve together. So it's really important to stress that we're very aware that the needs of autistic people are unique in individuals and also in the populations. There are very, very different needs between autistic people and people with learning disabilities, but as I say, some commonalities. So what we're hoping to do really is start a campaign to talk about, would a commissioner be the answer, to start conversations, and hope we can have respectful conversations. But it's going to be very difficult without giving you some overview of what we're talking about. So here we go. We've looked at the concept of the Children's Commissioner, which is in terms of the pillars, if you like, that commissioner looks after, very, very relevant and can translate. However, the crucial thing is that we need a commissioner for autistic people and for people with learning disabilities to have some, for want of a better term, powers. We need that commission enshrined in law because we want a commissioner to be able to act, to take action and to recommend action. So, as I say, we're not able yet to get into the detail because that's part of a long process, but what I'm going to share now are the headline areas that we think a commissioner could be responsible for and could have powers to act on within law. So the main function, or one of the main functions, will and has to be consulting and involving autistic people and families. That lived experience is extremely important. It is the most important thing in formulating a strategy to prioritise and understand the needs of autistic people and their families. And we know that the autistic community is a diverse community. There are autistic people who have learning disabilities, there are autistic people who do not have learning disabilities, and we have the whole issue of mental health needs and conflation and confusion around that. But nonetheless, there are autistic people who have mental health needs and general physical health needs that are not well attended to. So that consultation is going to be vital to a commissioner being able to understand and be empowered to formulate a strategy and to engage with local authorities and Scottish Government around the needs of autistic people. An absolutely critical function of the Commission is promoting the rights of autistic people. Nick mentioned there about people's rights being not always being realised, sometimes being ignored. And I think the reasons for all of that are very, very complicated, and we need to get underneath that. We know that there are excellent policy intentions. We know that there are excellent practitioners out there. We know that there are, people in local authorities who absolutely want to do the best for the populations they serve. So we have to wonder why that doesn't happen. So we have to get underneath all of that and understand why these things happen and what we can do to enable people's rights to be realised. A critical role, again, is in conducting formal investigations. I suspect, like me, your heart sinks when we see yet again and again issues of abuse of individuals who are autistic and people who have learning disabilities, where we see where the system has failed people. We ourselves looked into the shameful extent of unlawful school exclusion in our country, And we need some authority in law there to actually investigate that and come out with realistic and pragmatic solutions to that, with a mechanism to compel organisations to act. So that's going to be, we think, absolutely critical. As is the ability to investigate individual cases. I know from our advice line, and I'm sure other people watching this will know from their own experience, the heartbreaking and stressful and enduring situations that some individuals are coping with and are being asked to cope with, completely inappropriate in terms of a level of service, or rather a level not of service, that they might be experiencing. So we have to have in there a commissioner able to investigate individual cases. And that's for all sorts of reasons that I've just mentioned, but also critically for what we see as a really, really important role of the commissioner, which is to promote good practice. If we don't learn from these individual and population situations, we are simply going to perpetuate these situations again and again and again and again. And that, unfortunately, is what we see. And so that mechanism to identify good practice through casework, and make recommendations about changes to practice through casework is pretty vital. So I guess you're probably wondering where this superhuman being is going to come from, and it is a big ask. It has to be considered. What are the mechanisms to do this? So for that reason, it's really important that we have the resource to do this and do this properly, that the unique needs of autistic people and the unique needs of people who have a learning disability are considered within any sort of systemic setup and the bureaucracy, if you like, around this. But what we envisage is that a role like a commissioner can not only be a human rights defender for the people we support and engage with and the wider community in Scotland, but can also be a leader of change, a systemic change, a leader of systemic change, because we have lived with the repeated experiences of people for long enough, really. So we know that not everyone will recognise this as the solution. We know that people will have their own views, and so we hope that we can have those, as I said earlier, respectful conversations about how we might move this forward, or how we achieve all those things that we are hoping to achieve. If we didn't have a commissioner, how would we achieve that? Because those needs and those issues are still there, and they're persisting, and in many cases they're deepening, they're getting more significant. So we hope that you will engage with this discussion, take time to reflect and think about the concept of a commissioner, and tell us what you think.
Yeah. As Charlene says, we're not there yet. There's a lot of way to go, but we hope that we can go on this journey with you, and in the end, we'll achieve something that will make a real difference to autistic people and their families. So thank you so much for listening to us both, and we look forward to seeing you all in the future.